I am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. South Africans are voting this week in national and provincial elections, and polls indicate that support for the ruling African National Congress, or ANC, could fall below 50% for the first time since 1994, when it became a democratic country. And today we're joined by Dr. Frans Cronje Chair. He's the chair of the Social Research Foundation in South Africa, and we're hoping that he can provide us insights on how this election should be viewed internationally. Hi, Dr. Cronje, thanks for joining us.
Linda, hi, nice to be here.
So you've done a lot of research and polls leading up to this election. What does it reveal about the changing political landscape in South Africa?
Well, it's an important date later this week. It's on Wednesday when South Africans go to vote, both within the country, and I'll start there for you, and also the broader geostrategic implications. 30 years ago, South Africa became a democracy. The apartheid era ended. Nelson Mandela led his party, the African National Congress, to victory. And in the first democratic election, the one in 94, that party secured about 63% of the vote. In its first decade in power, it saw that number lift. It peaked in 2004, a decade in at about 70% of the vote, so very politically dominant. And that initial dominance was a function of success. In its first decade in power, the number of people with jobs had doubled. There'd been vast state-driven welfare and service delivery in South African parlance. That means housing and electricity rollout programs. The share of families without electricity, for example, fell from just under 50% at the end of apartheid to under 20% at the end of the first decade of democracy. 10 formal houses were built in that first decade for every one shack that was newly erected, and ANC support lifted as a consequence. But in the second half of the democratic era, the half that concludes now, many of those trends reversed. The relatively strong economic performance the country had seen in its first 15 years as a democracy slowed as the country literally ran out of electricity. Large-scale blackouts affected industry and households, often for hours a day. Corruption became much more prevalent. Investor sentiment on South Africa took a nosedive. Levels of fixed investment as a share of GDP, for example, dived very steeply. The job creation of the first decade slowed down. The extent to which living standards were improving stagnated and then began to reverse. And as a consequence, support for the African National Congress Party began to die. And in 2019, when South Africans last went to vote for a national government, support fell to just under 60% for the first time. It was just under 58%, in fact. Polls through 2022 and 2023 put support at just on around the 50% mark, and I happen to chair one of the country's polling groups. That's a good vantage point from which to look at such things. And that remained the case until very much into earlier this year, in fact, when a new startup party on the East Coast, led by a great rival, a former leader of the African National Congress, great rival of the current president, launches a party on that East Coast. There's a province called KwaZulu-Natal. It's politically the sort of fat lady of South African politics, and that party shoots up to about 10% of the vote. And the implication of that is the African National Congress that had been polling at near 50, started polling at near 40%. They've staged a bit of a fight back over the past several weeks. This morning's numbers have just appeared in my office, and we run a track, so we measure these things every day of the week. And on the current numbers, the ANC sitting in the mid-40s, but is tracking a little bit upwards. And that's 2 days to go, 3 days to go until the vote. So if you follow the track, looks like the ANC may surrender its national majority for the first time, and for the first time since becoming a democracy, South Africa may be in a position to see some kind of change of administration.
So we're looking at coalitions then. What kind of coalitions can we expect? Can we expect a centrist one there's quite a number of quite fragmented parties on that side, or they're moving to the left towards this party you were talking about, the Umkhonto we Sizwe party and the Economic Freedom Fighters, another sort of more Marxist-leaning group?
Well, if you're watching South Africa from abroad, this is the great question. And it's not just a question that will be answered in the course of the next month or several weeks as possibly a new administration's put together. It's really the question that's going to be asked of South Africa over the next decade, as it seems likely on current trends that the African National Congress's diminishing support will accelerate. And the first thing I'd say to anyone who asks that question is, remember that when South Africa became a democracy, 1994, that's in a unipolar world. The Cold War has ended. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Much of the Western world is beginning to live in what it thought was the era of the end of history, that the last great threat to the Western liberal democratic order had collapsed, that liberal democracy had triumphed in the world and would spread throughout the world. For the African National Congress in South Africa, which had long been housed in exile in the Soviet Union and East Germany, it needed to tread carefully because its great Soviet ally had faltered. China was yet to, it was clearly emerging, but yet to firmly emerge as a global power. And discretion was perhaps the better part of valor. And the South African government maintained relatively strong relations with Western capitals. There were contradictions in those relations. But increasingly over the years, as Western democracies in Africa in particular, but also elsewhere, have been reluctant to bring hard power forward, have perhaps to some extent been on the retreat, and as a multipolar world has emerged, South Africa's governing administration has found that it doesn't need to be quite as circumspect as it once was. And relationships with key Western rivals, China, Iran, Russia, have blossomed. And the inflection point of this change of administration feeds exactly into that point. What happens now? Is an administration delivered, a coalition government that aligns more firmly with the West? There are plausible routes to that. We can get into those in a moment. Or does the alternative happen? And is a coalition government starting to emerge, may already be doing so, that aligns South Africa far more closely to Russia, China, Iran? And the implications of that, we can also go into in this chat, are absolutely immense. But tell me where you want to go next with this, and I'll...
No, I want to know about the implications if we go left or more centrist.
In South Africa, there is an official opposition party called the Democratic Alliance. And that party's thinking is broadly Western aligned. It's a typical Western liberal democratic organization. If the faltering African National Congress leadership is later in a position where it needs a significant partner, this party called the Democratic Alliance will have somewhere between 20 and 25% of the vote in this election. So where the faltering African National Congress needs a significant partner to help restore a national majority, and if the internal faction fighting in the African National Congress leans west, that's an obvious deal to make. And the consequence of that would be that South Africa would be very much more positioned as a Western ally than as an ally of the West's great rivals. But there are alternative options available. The MK party of Mr. Zuma, the former leader of the African National Congress, the great rival in some respects, although not in all respects, of Mr. Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, leader of the African National Congress, would certainly to look to ally against the West. And his party is polling at around 10%. There's a second relatively far left party, also a splinter that emerged from the African National Congress more than a decade back, called the Economic Freedom Fighters. I mean, they're quite explicit that they would firmly align South Africa against the West. Statements as far as arming Russia, for example, in its campaign in Ukraine. Now, occasionally, if you do what I do, you get a little bit of insight into where these things are going. And the insight I have for you is that it is completely unclear at this time which way the later alignment is going to shift. If the African National Congress this time round, we've got it currently in the mid-40s, if it's in the mid-40s, it will likely cobble together a government of small rats and mice parties, the 1%ers, 2%ers, get it just over the line. It will then delay any firm decision on direction, on whether this is going to go pro-Western or whether South Africa is going to go anti-Western. But in the fullness of time, we vote every 5 years on a national level in South Africa. That question's going to be answered. And I tell you now, and we're pretty close to some of this stuff, I tell you now, it is quite unclear when that decision is made. Is it going to be a split to the West? Is it going to be a split against the West? And the implications, not just for South Africa, but for observers around the world, are really very significant.
Can we look at the presidency? So if President Cyril Ramaphosa, basically loses this election, and fingers will be pointed at him, that it might be his presidency that caused this. How do you see it? Do you see him still staying president? What about his alternative, the deputy president, which is Paul Mashatile, which you don't know what kind of alignment he might choose?
Linda, at the foundation, we're quite good at saying what we know. And if we don't know, saying we don't know. And we don't know. If it's very near 50%, Mr. Ramaphosa's cabinet will likely lean on him to remain for a time. There's a carrot next year, which is the chairmanship of the G20, which may be something he aspires to. But he has previously looked to exit. There are rivals that would seek to push him out of that party. And it remains our call on balance is if it's near 50, he will remain in command for a time, but likely exit ahead of the next election.
We've just looked at some of these statements over the weekend. There was a chant at a rally, which is a pro-Palestinian chant and suggests the elimination of Israeli-occupied territories. So, what does that mean for how he is positioning himself if he stays in power?
Well, it's exactly the point I was making to you earlier, that observers from abroad must realize that when South Africa became a democracy, when the African National Congress came to power, it comes to power in a unipolar world, and that has changed, and that it's a multipolar world. And the African National Congress has options beyond the West. And nothing has changed, I'd say, intrinsically in the positioning of the party. I think it's always been poorly understood in the West. What's happened is the environment around it has changed, and this has emboldened it in some of the positions that it's taken. And the chant from the river to the sea, which Mr. Ramaphosa repeated at a final massive rally of his party in Johannesburg this past weekend, is a good example of that. And it's a good segue that to start to get into some of the longer term implications of what happens. Why does it matter to the world if South Africa breaks firmly one way or the other in terms of its foreign policy positioning? There's a lot out there, You can start with the Indian Ocean Rim, which South Africa commands the significant coastline, also remains influential all the way up Africa's east coast. The Carnegie Endowment, for example, sees that Indian Ocean Rim as absolutely critical to future military engagements, and specifically the foundation speaks of the ability to exercise military presence around the great shipping choke points. Something goes wrong in Suez, a contemporary problem. A lot of global bulk shipping needs to move around the southern tip of Africa, straight past South Africa's east and west coast, and past the strategically very important naval base at Simonstown, which is almost right on the tip of where the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans converge off the coast of South Africa. That's important. I mean, the Hudson Institute do some great work on this stuff. They've put out some recent material on how the choke points, the shipping choke points in the Indian Ocean, becoming increasingly hostile to Western actors and Western influence. There's been spectacularly successful efforts by China to expand eastwards into the Pacific through the Solomon Islands, westwards onto Africa's coastline. There have even been attempts to sort of march through the Mediterranean at Haifa and at Italy, in what the Hoover Institution called, I think ominously, stepping stones to one day rule the Atlantic. So if South Africa, in over the next decade, when this question will be settled, I think, of its foreign policy leanings, if it turns firmly westwards or firmly anti, I mean, the implications in the Indian Ocean are immense. You can then go to the Atlantic Ocean, the west coast. Robert O'Brien, who's former security advisor to President Trump, had written some really, really high-quality stuff on the strategic importance of the South Atlantic. That same South African naval base at Simonstown commands the entrance out from the south into the South Atlantic. There are very important port facilities in Namibia. Walvis Bay, there's a deep water port, South Africa's immediate northern neighbor. Just recently, a massive oil find off the Namibian coast. Then there are the Angolan ports at Namib and Lobito and Luanda. Can extend all the way up to Bata in Equatorial Guinea, which some Western national security thinkers are already talking about. What if China establishes a naval facility, sails from Bata, closer, Linda, to New York, than if it had a naval facility in Hawaii? The opening battles of the First and Second World Wars, the naval engagements, are in the South Atlantic. Mrs. Thatcher sends the largest battle group since the end of the Second World War to the Falklands, not just because of national pride, but because of the strategic importance. So which way South Africa is ultimately going, which is what this election is starting to answer the question. The strategic implications off the west coast and the east coast of South Africa are immense. Then you can get onto the continent itself. As ISIS was displaced from the Middle East, Southern Africa becomes a sort of global epicenter of terrorist activity in the world. Arguably, there's a global terrorism index, which is a monitor of the vulnerability of a society to terror attacks. A range of African countries now have worse terror indice scores than some of the old Middle Eastern staples have. The African Center for Security Studies, which is a U.S. Department of Defense funded think tank, has produced really interesting work on this, that the ability to destabilize African economies is a spigot of sorts that can determine the flows of immigrants into Europe, and identifies explicitly the effect that such immigration has on European societies. So the security question extends off the oceans onto the African mainland itself. Economically, Africa's population is set to grow by 1 billion people over the next 30 years. On top of the continent, how's this? Already being home to more cities of over 1 million people than is the case for Europe and America combined. And those cities are home to people who will have the ideas that will, to a great extent, determine the voting patterns of their governments on global fora, such as at the General Assembly of the UN, and there are 50 such votes. Now, some Western rivals have written very well done strategic documents about the importance of capturing that market. So diplomatically, it becomes important. Economically, the cliches such as critical minerals control, if the continent becomes more hostile to Western actors, the longer-term back foot that they placed on is quite immense. And then there's just straightforward consumer markets. Africa looks a lot better than it did 50 years ago. The number of changes of government through coups and assassinations, if that's your benchmark, is way down. The share of trade dollars now beats the share of aid dollars flowing into the continent, hands down. The consumer market just around South Africa and southern African states around it is now 2/3 the size of that of South America, and it's growing twice as fast. So, if you're a South African, this election is important, which way it goes. But if you're outside and you're looking at what is going to happen this Wednesday and what that says about the longer-term political drift, and then the great unknown, the question of how a future coalition, because that's necessarily what we're moving towards, is put together, and where it leans on foreign policy, the implications are really quite spectacular, Melinda.
That was an amazing reminder of the strategic importance of South Africa. People might just think this is this country at the southern tip of Africa that we kind of forget it's fine. So can we look at, you talked about democracy and the importance of that. Is democracy safe in South Africa after 30 years?
I'd say it's never safe anywhere in the world, but it's about as safe in South Africa as it's going to be anywhere else. We test this stuff in great detail. South Africans are still firmly of the view, the great majority of public opinion, that going to the ballot box is an effective way of changing the administration. And what we're going through now, the breakup of the once dominant African National Congress's political control, is simply a consequence of the fact that 30 years ago the country changed to become somewhere where if one day the bulk of people weren't satisfied with the performance of its government, they might do something to change. And that's what's happening now. And it's in that respect in the minority of post-colonial emerging markets that have a serious prospect of changing peacefully. And you don't take that sort of thing for granted. But so that's the present. The longer term, the more interesting question for us is, as that process plays out, as public opinion brings about through the ballot box a change of administration, where does that lean in the longer term? Now, we've tested some of this. We were very interested in this question, tested a lot of foreign policy alignment, and we'd say that on balance, if you ask South Africans, West or not, on balance, you'll still get answers that lean towards the West, but not definitively so. And in fact, it depends very heavily now on how you phrase the question. If you phrase the question in a manner that makes it appear as if there could be disproportionate advantages to turning away from the West and doubling down on relations with Iran, Russia, and China, then you can see the potential to drive public opinion to a point where that is in fact what the process of democratic change in South Africa may ultimately deliver, and vice versa. And so there's very much behind the sort of the political battle in the country, there's a battle of the diplomats and of positioning. And the West probably still has an edge, but I think it's a diminishing edge. And I think strategically, Western diplomats now face disadvantages. They tend to try to deal with state actors, whereas in a lot of Southern Africa, in fact, across the continent, non-state actors are often more influential and important, which their global rivals, the West global rivals, find much easier to deal with non-state actors. A second problem is a very difficult one, which is that Africa to succeed, and South Africa particularly so, given the weak economic performance of the past decade, needs very efficient energy sources and a merit-based economy to succeed. But the effect of culture wars in the West means that the answers African governments get back to those questions from Western diplomats are now often counterproductive to Africa's development needs. The aversion to hydrocarbons, threats that South Africa's government faces to its exports if it doubles down on its coal fleet to sustain and secure the levels of electricity production necessary to ensure an economic growth recovery. It frankly gets a lot better advice from Russia and China when it asks what to do on energy. So the 30-year ago picture, again, so useful to go back to that, the unipolar world, when the advice, South Africa, let's just deal with it, would have got from the Western world, would have been chiefly sensible, and if followed, which it largely was, would secure an economic recovery, which it largely did. In this new multipolar world, not only does a future South African government have alternatives to lean towards, but the advice it gets from Western capitals is not always in line with the best interests of its economy or the material circumstances of its people. And it's on that point, as much as anything, that Western influence in Southern Africa and around South Africa, if it is to falter to any significant extent, will falter over the next 10 or 20 years.
Dr. Frans Cronje from the Social Research Foundation. Fascinating insights. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Linda.